I'm Jelani Cobb, and so we're going to just proceed. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then they'll each speak briefly, and then I will join them at the table, and we'll kind of begin our conversation about historians in the public sphere, how and why we should write op-eds and engage the media. To, I guess, my far left is Yoni Applebaum, who is a senior editor at The Atlantic, where he oversees the politics section. Mr. Applebaum is a social and cultural historian of the United States. Before joining The Atlantic, he was a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard University. He previously taught at Babson College and Brandeis University, where he received his PhD in American history. Kate Landdeck is to my near left. Kate Landdeck is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Pioneers Oral Research Project, at Texas Women's University. Her primary topic of interest is the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, of World War II. She has been featured on NPR and PBS. Her expertise has also been recognized in outlets such as Al Jazeera America, The Washington Post, CNN, NBC Nightly News, USA Today, The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. She has written for The Atlantic and The Huffington Post and numerous aviation publications. And between the two is Jonathan Zimmerman, who may have to leave out a little bit early because he has a flight as well, but we're happy that he's able to be here. He is a professor of education and history at New York University. His research explores public education and issues of citizenship. He is currently working on 2 books on higher education, and he co-edits 2 book series, American Institutions and Society at Cornell University Press, and History and Philosophy of Education at the University of Chicago Press. He has authored more than 300 op-eds in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major newspapers and magazines. He's also featured on a bi-monthly radio show, That's History, on Philadelphia's National Public Radio affiliate. And as I mentioned earlier, I am Jelani Cobb. I am a staff writer at The New Yorker. I'm also Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and Director of the Africana Studies Institute there as well. And I write about a number of things. Most recently, I've been writing a good deal about race and policing and kind of racial violence in the Obama era. And so with that, we're just going to jump right in, given our need to pay attention closely to time. And if we will start with Kate and then work our way left with our introductory comments. Thank you.
Okay. Introductory 8 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Well, hi. Are we good? Okay. Hi, I'm Kate Landdeck. I want to say I'm very humbled to be on this panel with some really impressive people. I hope my experience, which is a little different from theirs, will add to the conversation. I teach history at Texas Women's University. It's a university primarily for women. We've got 90% women, 10% men, but we're a state institution. And for the past 4 years, I've worked with the Op-Ed Project and the Public Voices Thought Leadership program, which Emory University here, if any of you are from Emory, Emory is one of the universities that does that as well. And I work with the media in general. So I'm here today to talk about why historians should engage the media through both the opinion pieces that my colleagues have written so many of, and engaging journalists directly. My experience with both of these, I haven't published as many op-eds. The ones that I did weren't particularly earth-shattering, but it was a good experience. Most of my experience is working with the fellowship, which is about training scholars, particularly women scholars and people of color, to engage in the public sphere. So I study the women Air Force service pilots from World War II. And that's where most of my media work has come from. I picked a really good topic in graduate school. I give that advice to my students all the time. Pick a good topic. You never know what will happen. I've been studying them for about 20 years now. I don't have my book published. It's ready if you know anybody. But I do have public work that has established me as the expert on the women, work with documentary films and different things like that. So my experience with the media has really come in 3 waves. In 2010, these women were granted the Congressional Gold Medal. And then in 2014, I helped design and build a Rose Parade float, which sounds very strange, I know, but it's a really good public history exhibit that 800,000 people saw it live and millions saw worldwide. So it was a good thing. And then they're actually in the news today. They were on the news, MSNBC this morning. I should be on NBC Nightly News tomorrow, unless I get cut, which I fully expect. And because they've been uninvited from Arlington National Cemetery. Yeah, thank you for the mms, right? Thank you. And apparently I'm a bit of an opinionated tweeter on my belief that historians need to engage the public. And so Jim Grossman of AHA seems to think that's okay and invited me to be part of this panel. So I'm thankful to AHA and the fellow panelists. First, I want to say that while I completely respect scientists and I'm obviously grateful to things they do, I believe historians are the smartest people in the most rooms when it comes to relatable knowledge. Now,
except this room.
No, we're all historians.
Oh, you're right.
I know, isn't that fun?
Yeah.
Right? So TW has one of the best nursing programs in the country, so I don't get laughter and agreement very often when I say this. So I'm glad to be here. Now, we're trained as historians, we're trained throughout graduate school to be increasingly an expert on increasingly narrow things, right? Narrow subjects, right? We start with American history, right? I'm an expert on American history, and then I'm an expert on 20th century American history, and then I'm an expert on World War II, and then I'm an expert on women in World War II, and then I'm an expert on the women Air Force service pilots of World War II, right? That's how our training goes, right? By the time we get to our dissertation, this is what we know, right? Right?
You forgot my navel.
Yeah, right. And then we become one of the 2% of people in the United States who has earned a PhD, right? And we walk away from our PhD believing we know this, right? But we immediately have to start zooming back out, right? Whatever job we get, we have to zoom back out. We have to, if we're teaching, they take you from the degree to teaching freshmen about American history. Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to talk about this today. They don't need this. They need this, right? Or if you work in a museum or for public policy, whatever, you've got to be able to zoom out, right? So that's, it can take a while for us to do that, right? You see the first and second year teachers and they're all way too detailed. It's not a graduate seminar, it's a freshman seminar, right? But we have this knowledge, right, at different levels along the way. So shift to current events, right? How many of you have been watching the news or reading the newspaper and you see something happen, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or the Syrian refugees, and you think to yourself, oh, this is related to this, or this is similar to that, or you know the backstory of why it happened, right? You understand current events in a different way than the majority of the American public, right? And what we know matters. We can shape the way people think about things and the way they understand the world around them. More historians, and there are many who are already doing this, but more historians gaining a public voice can do a number of things. First, it can make the world a better place. Yes, I'm an optimist, right? But understanding things is always better, right? Second, it can add value to our profession. I'm sure many of you have noticed that with a few endowed exceptions, and good for you if you're one of those, historians are not the most highly paid faculty on most campuses, right? Can I get some, right? And in part it's because our employers and the public don't see our value. They just don't really understand what we do, right? We get made fun of in the media, right? The Big Bang Theory, they like to make fun of historians a lot. My own campus, I do oral history, and I got to, I haven't had to do IRB long before, now we really don't have to do IRB, but 13 years ago, I filed for an exemption, and the IRB committee sent me a letter back saying, well, this isn't research, so you don't need IRB. Yeah, I got really mad, and then I decided to just be quiet. You're right, thank you. But they just don't get it, right? So a public voice helps make what we do more obvious and more valued. And third, it can elevate your own work and your own place in your own community. And by community, I mean broadly. That can be, obviously mom's going to like it, the best, but your university, your town, your state, your field, right, on all those different levels. And you don't have to publish in the New York Times, though I would love to publish in the New York Times, right, to make a difference, right? You don't have to do that. There's so many venues now, it's hard to keep up. It can be in your local paper, it can be an online source, The Hill influences public policy. Getting it out there is what's important, and because it is also digital, you have no idea how many people can pick those things up, right, and it can grow. So most of my experience, though, I've helped with the training of people with this op-ed training. Most of my experience is with the media in general. So have any of you ever been quoted in the media and hated it and swore you would never, ever, ever, ever do that again? Yeah, right? They don't get it, they twist our words, all these things, right? So we just have to be better at that. Because journalists today are under incredible pressure. It's always been a time-intensive job, but in our digital world, those deadlines keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Where we spend weeks, months, and years working on topics and then editing and re-editing and editing and re-editing, they have hours to do their work, sometimes a whole day. And yet they too value accuracy, right? They want the story to go out correctly. That's why they do what they do. So we need to help them to be accurate, and we need to give them a deeper understanding of our topics and their topics. Now, my experience is a little different because I work with living women, right? They're not for much longer. They're all in their 90s, and I don't know how I'm going to adjust. So it's a little different experience. But I've seen where when I work with the media, you can get the story out there properly, right? So my best example is when we did the Rose Parade, which again is a very odd thing to do, but we got media coverage all over the world. They were in Australia, they were in Japan, TF1 out of France did a story during the Rose Parade, and then did a longer story during the D-Day coverage that June on these women. So we got their story out there to the public all over the world, right? And the first thing that I did when I realized I had gotten myself into this, it was not my idea, but it worked out beautifully, was I made a press sheet, right? Which is just a one-page document with the facts to make it easy for those journalists to get the story right. And they did. They got it right over and over and over, and not one story that I've seen out of that Rose Parade, out of the hundreds and hundreds, had anything incorrect. And that was something I was incredibly proud of, more than anything else. Now, if you do work with the media, you're going to get cut out, right? This recent campaign about Arlington, I talked with the AP reporter for 45 minutes for the first story he did, and then about 25 minutes for the second story that he did. And the one quote in the first story he took was that me calling the Secretary of the Army mean-spirited, which I did not intend, really, but anything you say can and will be used in the media. And then the second one, he used a more appropriate quote because I didn't say anything about being mean. But I gave him the back history. I helped him understand what questions he should be asking and who he should be asking those questions. And so I feel really good about that. When we did the Rose Parade coverage, I did an interview with CNN, which then got cut and wasn't in the final program. I did an interview with All Things Considered, which then got cut and wasn't in the final program, which is very disappointing. Mom, I'm going to be on TV. No, where are you? Should I call them? No. All right. But I set them up with interviews, and I set them up with documents to take pictures of, and so they were beautiful reports. It would have been lovely for my ego and my mother's ego if I had been on camera or on the radio for those two, but the story was right. And that's really what we're about, right? We write for each other. We hope that people will read our books and our articles. But this is an opportunity to get our history out there, whether our name gets tagged to it or not. And so I think it's really important for you to think, and for all of us as historians, to think about how can we take what we know here all the way through here and make that valuable to the public in a very accurate but accessible way. So thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan? Okay.
Yeah. Well, with all the talks of moms here, it's funny, when I speak on Sunday mornings, it's generally only blood relatives in the audience. But maybe we're related, because sometimes Americans are, even though we don't really like to talk about that either. Also, just so you know, my radio show, it's called That's History. I don't like the title, because that's what Americans say when they don't care about something. Right? That's history. Or my favorite, that's ancient history. I have a friend who's a Byzantine historian. I love to tease her about that. That's ancient history. And last, I just want to say that I have two young adult daughters, and the only thing I've ever done that they care about is I was on Jon Stewart twice. So all these other op-eds, everything I'm going to talk about, they couldn't care less. But that, I got some cred. Why do I do this? I mean, most historians don't. The simplest reason is really selfish. Although I do study the history of religion, I'm not a Hindu, and I don't believe in reincarnation. I'm going to have one life. And no offense to the people in this audience, but I don't want to spend it just writing things that you, people like you, are going to read. Obviously, I want you to read what I write, but not just you. I have met scholars in different disciplines who say they don't care who reads what they write, and basically I think they're liars. I mean, maybe not all of them, but I just can't, I don't know how you could get enough engine, right, if you really felt that way, and I certainly don't. So that's probably the biggest reason. It's just pure selfishness. I want people to read what I write, and not just a tiny little audience of the other handful of people that study what I study. But then I actually do feel that I have a duty to do this. I'm somebody who has received a huge amount of privilege in my life, starting with how I look, but mainly with my education. I feel like I have a duty to share that with other people. So, with my grad students, my PhD students, this is not optional. They have to write op-eds, because I want to not just teach them the craft of it, but I also want to inscribe this idea that you have a duty to share what you're learning with a big audience, because you were incredibly lucky to have all this time and space to study the things that you do. The other pitch I make to the grad students is that actually it will make your dis better. And I do believe that, because it will force you to crystallize in a very succinct way what your point is, right? Which is obviously the hardest thing to do when you're in grad school. Let me tell you, an 800-word op-ed, it will make you do that. It will really force you to distill what you think is important. The other reason I do it, there are several others, is it teaches me a lot about the country that I live in. Sometimes it's not stuff you want to know, right? But it's important to learn about. There are really people out there that hate people with last names like Zimmerman. At NYU, you don't encounter them, at least not openly. But let me tell you, out in the blogosphere, you do, right? They exist. right? And so if you have a last name like Zimmerman, people will write you and they'll say, what kind of name is that? It's like, what do you think, asshole? It's a Jehovah's Witness name, right? In my younger days, my salad days.
Sorry, is this the first time anyone has used asshole at an AHA? Okay, I've never heard this before.
Mark the date and time. Yeah. When I was a younger person, I would actually tell those people where to put it, and that you don't want to do because, of course, that's what they want, right? And then the Jewish guy's cornered, and then they're really getting off on it. So you definitely don't want to do that. But then there are other things that aren't quite as nasty on the surface, but end up being super depressing. So, look, I write an op-ed probably every week or every other week, so I write about almost every contentious issue, and one of them in the past 10 years has been marriage equality and gay rights. And when I write about that, it's really interesting. I get both really antagonistic and really complimentary notes. And the only thing they have in common is everyone who's writing thinks I'm gay. So the complimentary ones, sometimes like guys try to cruise me, which I find sort of cute. It doesn't bother me. But after the cuteness wears off and you start to think about what's going on here, it's super depressing, right? The only reason you would express solidarity with a group is you're of that group, right? I mean, try making a small d democratic politics on that principle, right? You can't. It is not possible, right? Gays are a minority in this country. In fact, a tiny minority. Both gays and straights, you've probably seen these numbers exaggerate the incidence of homosexuality in the culture, So gays are a minority. They always have been, always will be, right? Unless they have allies who aren't gay, forget about it, right? But here you have people that are writing, again, both to criticize and to applaud me, and everyone thinks I'm gay. Right? Really, I mean, you start to think about it. You don't want to think about it too much, right? But it tells you something important. And let me also just say that it's not all depressing, right? For me, one of the really important things, especially given where I work, is that my op-ed world gives me Republican interlocutors. At New York University, I don't have them, right? I mean, again, if I've got Republican colleagues, they're like closeted gays. Right? And among my students, I mean, they come out to me in their papers and I've got to tell them to express themselves. Be yourself. It gets better. Stop denying yourself. We accept you. It gets better. Right? So NYU is not a place where I'm going to get critical, interested, informed Republican response to what I think. But in the blogosphere, I do. Some of it is whacked, and you know what? Some of it isn't. Some of it's really smart, The worst idea, the most depressing idea that's extant in our culture, it's that somebody who disagrees with you is either morally warped or stupid, okay? Sometimes they are, both those things, right? But if you think that's always the case, I think you're a little warped, okay? And possibly maybe even slightly stupid. When I write articles about this subject, I'll say, look, all of us voted for Obama. I voted for Obama, but I think my workplace would be more interesting if there were people here who didn't vote for Obama. I'll have colleagues write to me and say, well, of course nobody here voted for Obama. We're smart. That's why we're Democrats, And I'm like, listen, dude, Milton Friedman and Saul Bellow both voted for Republican candidates, right? You may be smarter than them, right? I mean, there are a lot of you out there, right? I don't know you, right? But I can tell you one thing, I'm not, all right? And the op-ed world gives me exposure, right, to really wise, smart Republicans that I don't work with because they're not in my workplace. So what do? In addition to write these things, what I try to do is I try to missionary. I try to mission about this, which is what actually I'm doing right now. So I conduct op-ed clinics with grad students, both at my own institution and others. I go to the Miller Center at UVA every year where they have a fellowship program in political history. And I try to teach people how to spin op-eds off their dissertations. I'm going to stop talking in a moment because I want there to be plenty of time from you, but I just want to emphasize that there are 3 Zimmerman rules, right, for op-eds, if you're interested. Actually 4. The 3 are called the 3P, okay? They are punctual, pithy, and persistent. If you want to get into press, it's got to be tonight, okay? Because the news cycle turns very quickly. Sometimes you don't have time tonight because something's going on with your kid or your job or anything, and that's all real. But You do have to carve out a place right there to do it because the story is going to pass. Pithy means that, well, you can begin an op-ed in many, many ways, but here's one thing you can never do. You can't begin an op-ed with "scholars have long debated X." Because when I do the workshop, sometimes the students will give that to me. Listen, I'm a scholar, and that makes my eyes glaze over, right? What if you weren't? Okay, just imagine the somnolence, right? So there are a lot of different ways to do it, right? But you can't begin it that way. And then persistent. I find that a lot of my grad students, they'll send it to a paper or a website, and it gets dinged, and then they're like, "John, it didn't work." Mm-hmm. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Given how many venues there are, it'll work, right? And this is also great training for grad students because, of course, it inures them to failure, right? Which is the key to every success, right? Especially in our gig, right? Show me a successful academician, right? And I'll show you somebody who's dinged, right? 9 times for every one time they made it. Whatever it is, grant, job, this, right? That's the key to everything, right? And that's been the key to me, failing. I'm not just talking about my dating record in high school, by the way, all right? Okay, just failing over and over and over again, right? And that's what you do, right? And then eventually somebody picks it up, right? So you have to do those 3 things. Let me just say, if you've written something or you have an idea and you're trying to get it into print, and you think a pair of eyes, i.e. my eyes, would be helpful, please write to me, okay? This is a labor of love for me, and I have lots of other things going on, but I'll gladly put it aside to help you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay, Yoni?
So like everyone else here, I'm immensely grateful and surprised by the turnout this morning, so thank you for sticking around. One thing I've discovered this year coming back here is that this conference is a lot more fun if you're not actively looking for a job. So I'm enjoying myself this time around. I want to be a little contrarian here and say that I hate op-eds. And I hate them for a few reasons that I think may spark some interesting discussion here. One is it's a genre that takes its structure and form from technological demands, right? 800, 850 words is about one standard column width of broadsheet newsprint. And so it's not that these things are 850 words because that's a particularly good length for making an argument or a particularly good way to lay out your evidence. You're meeting what is now largely an antiquated technological constraint. The second is if you printed out most historians' op-eds, usually if I see a familiar name on the op-ed page, I'll just skip the op-ed and look at the bottom for their new book because it's a more efficient way to find out what it's about. They can be very useful promotional tools, but if you printed most op-eds out and you submitted them to you as freshman compositions, I suspect that you would be brutal on them. They make very generalized claims. They tend not to marry their evidence to their argument terribly well, so the argument will be about some contemporary event and the evidence will be about some other long ago event that the scholar is actually familiar with. They may not present much evidence at all. It may be straight assertion with an occasional piece of evidence. If the evidence is there, the source probably isn't attributed, and so on down the line. When we engage our publics, I fear that as historians, we usually take everything that makes our work distinctive and valuable, everything that we demand from each other and from our students, and strip it out, leaving the public with claims based on our inherent authority, on the credentials that we've earned, on the fact that there is a book that stands behind the argument. And I think that is not always the most productive way to engage. I'm dealing here sort of with op-eds as a general class. Obviously, there are lots of scholars, Jonathan prominent among them, who use this genre, like any other genre, can be used to great effect, to open conversations, to raise questions, to introduce evidence. But for the modal historian, I don't know that if every member of the AHA tried to become a weekly op-ed columnist, that there are in fact enough newspapers in the country to support that. So I'm speaking more to the scholar who has labored for a while on a topic and has something to say about it. And I'd like to urge all of you to dare to commit history in public, not to be embarrassed about it. If your argument requires 1,500 words, well, there are lots of outlets these days that can run that. If it requires 6,000 words, why not give that a shot? You have stories to tell and things that attracted you to your subjects in the first place. Very rarely was it some ephemeral contemporary event that you sought to illuminate by spending 6 years in an archive. And so to present your work, to sell it that way, you should care about my work because this thing that is in the headline right now will be explained by it, is to sell your own work short. You can certainly draw those connections to speak to its contemporary resonance, but to frame it that way can be, I think, deeply problematic. And beyond that, dare to show your evidence. You know interesting things, the unique value that you bring to the table as a historian is unlikely to be that you are the best writer. Op-ed pages are full of people who churn out prose for a living. Most historians don't. Historians don't write very much at all in comparative terms compared to most journalists, certainly. Maybe you are. Maybe you're a brilliantly gifted writer, but that's not the thing that most historians of my experience are bringing to the table. They're probably not the most experienced at writing op-eds because it's something that historians tend to emerge from the bunkers to do every few years when they have something new to promote. What you have, your unique advantage, is that you know something about the world and you know it uniquely well and you know why it matters because that's why you started studying it in the first place. And your ability to convey that to an audience is something which is non-replicable. That's something that nobody else on earth can do. I've yet to meet the historian who doesn't have something to say to an audience. And I think that's also liberating because often op-ed pages are dominated by a relatively narrow set of concerns. And either you're trying to shoehorn your work on medieval Europe into a contemporary debate over classroom education, or you're left feeling as if the public is uninterested and unengaged with your work. When there probably is some sort of a consequence or a stakes to your work that you can articulate to colleagues, and if you dared to tell the public about it too, I think that people would often find that enthusiasm resonates. In the year I've been at the Landdeck, I've had the chance to partner with a number of scholars, some of whom I've seen today, others in the room I hope I'll have the chance to partner with in the future. But when I think back about some of the works I've been particularly satisfied to bring out, David Blight wrote 6,000 words for us on the multiple endings of the Civil War, a work that synthesized some of the scholarship that had been out there for a long time, but a deeply scholarly work. Walter Johnson did a kind of a quasi-journalistic piece looking at the history of taxation in Missouri, but specifically understanding how Ferguson, Missouri ended up bankrupt. It was a brilliant piece, deeply scholarly at the same time that it was deeply engaging. One of the most popular things I published in the last year was a quickly thrown together late-night blog post by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which was largely a collation of the declarations of secession from the various southern states. When more than 1 million people read those declarations of secession for the first time at a particular moment, just putting the primary sources in front of people and giving them enough context to understand what it is that they're encountering can be an immensely powerful act. Not an 800-word op-ed. I haven't done a word count on it. It's certainly thousands of words long with all those primary sources embedded within it. But that didn't stop people from reading all the way through to the end. You may not know this. If you are on a computer and you are reading, somebody is watching how far you are reading. And we can certainly see. Not you as individuals, but in aggregate, although there are outlets which do track you as individuals. Kate Massour and Great Downs wrote a piece for us about their project at the National Park Service, looking at how to commemorate Reconstruction. All of these were scholars talking about their work, writing on the basis of their research, and bringing it to the public. Some of them were speaking to a particular historical moment, some were not. And that is should be a liberating thing for all of us, that if it was interesting enough for you to devote, if it's not interesting enough to share to the public, I have to ask why you bother researching it in the first place. And if it is interesting enough to share with the public, then it's worth trying to find a way to do that. The other side of this coin is I as the Atlantic's Washington bureau chief, I'm building a team right now that'll hit 15 writers and editors by the end of the month. And I regularly tell them to call historians. It's a hard thing to do because many historians aren't used to taking the call, right? So for a variety of reasons, it can be an uncomfortable thing for historians to get a call like that from a journalist. Historians are not, people who don't often interact with the media may not understand deadline pressure, may sort of file the note away and call back the next day after the story was run. So that's sort of a very rudimentary thing. More to the point, I think many historians would like to tell a complicated story. So you get the journalists on the other end of the line, and you start to explain that really this starts with the French Revolution. And you walk them through it, right? And 20 minutes later, they're still nodding and taking notes. And what you're essentially doing is ceding to the journalist at the other end of the line the autonomy and ability to take anything you've said in those 20 minutes and decide that that is the key point. You have ceded your exercise of scholarly judgment to somebody who lacks all of the deep sourcing that you possess. Whereas if you turn around and give them a quote which is spoken like the quote you might actually wish to appear in print, that is an act of scholarship. That is an act of public engagement. It is not dissimilar from standing in front of a classroom and lecturing. You don't lecture on 67 in France by starting in 1789. You may start the semester there, but not that particular lecture. So you've got to frame it and construct it in a way that the journalist at the other end knows what it is that you think and is presenting your opinion, rather than getting a tremendous amount of background and selecting from within it. And then be proactive too. I think that the pitching advice is really good advice. I counted. It was the 19th pitch I received after I started at the Landdeck was written by a woman. That was tremendously discouraging to me. We track this stuff internally. If we turn down a pitch, particularly from a woman or a person of color, they're far less likely to come back and pitch a second time than, say, a white man of similar credentials. People who aren't quite sure that the public actually wants to hear from them for a variety of historical reasons, and it may be because they're the first member of their family to go to college. It doesn't have to be race, it doesn't have to be ethnicity, it doesn't have to be gender. There's all kinds of axes along this which operates. But it's really crucial to have the confidence to come back again and again, because that's ultimately what is going to succeed in putting your work before the public. And that's a problem where the failure to come back again and again, it's on the editors for not seeking out such voices. It's not on the scholars for not stepping forward, but to the extent that you have the power to change that dynamic, it's by putting yourself forward repeatedly. I don't mean to suggest that this is a burden that is justly shouldered by scholars, but it is an opportunity that can be seized should you care to seize it. So I guess those are my thoughts.
Thank you. I'm going to join you all now so we can get to So, can you all hear me? Okay. So I wanted to kind of just talk about one of the contextual points I think that's worth mentioning here, which is that we are in a kind of cacophony of opinion right now with multiple platforms in which people can, hold forth and people can, express themselves. And sometimes, as is often the case in democracy, it's the flashy, shiny thing that grabs people's attention, maybe not necessarily the most substantial thing. And so this idea of kind of scholars engaging with the public has been something that I've personally talked about a lot this year. People, requested that I speak on it a lot. But one of the things that struck me about it is that this seems to be thought of as novel, but it's really not. We could think about, Richard Hofstadter, or Daniel Moynihan, or Arthur Schlesinger, or there's a whole array of people who've been deeply engaged in not just engaging with media or the public, or you might turn on your radio and hear one of these people talking about the implications of the Civil War. I'm just really curious as to how we got to the point where the idea of someone being kind of a public scholar or someone engaging the public is thought of as a novel thing. I wonder if someone could talk about that.
Could I give a dweeby historical answer?
Sure. Please be dweeby.
I mean, I think that, Charles Beard would have been confused if he was called a public intellectual, right? I mean, he was by our standards, but the term didn't exist. He just felt that, again, it was part of his duty. And I think Hofstadter probably the same, but I think what happened is a couple things. I think, during the Cold War, I think it became dangerous for some historians in ways it hadn't been to engage in the ways you're describing. And then I think, in our own field, the great tragedy is that we created a people's history that people didn't read.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, we opened up the profession to, first of all kinds of voices that had been ignored or suppressed in terms of the practitioners, but also in terms of the subject matter, right? Human beings, Americans, the majority of whom weren't thought to have a history, right? And we created, and we're still trying to create, a people's history of it, right? But what if you made a people's history and nobody came? Right? Don't tell me there isn't a market for history in this country. Go to the Barnes & Noble if it's still open, right? And you'll see that there's a big market for it, right? Yet another biography of Lincoln, or something about Lincoln's dog, right? That's big, Lincoln's dog, right? But the kind of people's history that you see at a conference like this, right, isn't actually read by people. And I think there are many reasons for that, but obviously, one of them is there was more foundation money, right? There were grants that allowed more people to come to the profession. Again, I think that's all great, right? But what we lost was the Beardian idea that part of your job actually is not just to write about the people, but to engage the people as your readers.
I've got a slightly different take on this, which is that I think there's a selection bias at work. When we look back, the historians whose work stands out that we tend to remember are precisely the ones who did this kind of work, who tried to write for large public audiences in their books, who were otherwise public figures. It was true then and remains true today, frankly, that the best way to reach another historian with your work is not to publish in almost any scholarly journal, but to use a mainstream outlet. Because if you think about how you spend your downtime, maybe some of you had a subspecialty journal open on the flight here. More of you probably picked up a magazine off the newsstand. Historians are people too. And I've certainly
That's
found...
a radical idea.
That's my favorite quote.
This is the takeaway. This is the takeaway from the panel.
Historians are people.
Scholars have long debated, but it appears that historians are people too.
Yeah, bringing the Jehovah's Witnesses.
So there is a way in which that's always been the most effective way to sort of establish your historical reputation, and we remember the people who did it. I think there is something genuinely novel, or two things. One is there are many more places people can do this kind of work than there were even 10 years ago. As the number, and it may just be a blog post, right, on your own private blog, which people pick up and share within a scholarly community and then outside the scholarly community. It may be one of the host of new digital publications. It may be one of the very many print outlets which persist. And that proliferating array of outlets, all of which are sort of great hungry maws trying to devour as much content as they possibly can. They're eager. The editorial standards may not always be there, but they're eager to get it, and they're eager to put it out. And so there is, I think, actually more opportunity. And it shattered some of the gatekeeping functions, for better and for worse. Mm-hmm. So it shattered some of the gatekeeping functions in terms of quality and fact-checking and review that old-line publications had. And it has also allowed us to hear from a much richer and more diverse array of voices, which is a fabulous thing, right? So these things go, unfortunately, they go hand in hand. It's very difficult to see how you get one without the other, which is not to say that the work coming in that wouldn't meet those standards, just that the gatekeeping had positive and negative implications. But it travels further also, right? So it used to be that if you were a professor at a state college teaching your class, you might also care to engage the public by talking at your local history association, which is a fabulous thing to do, and I encourage all of you to do. It's those audiences just are lovely audiences. Or you might write an op-ed for the local paper. But your public engagement was unlikely to travel outside of the bounds of your particular community. That was probably even true if you were at Harvard, right? You might have written something for the Crimson or something for the Boston Globe, but people further afield were unlikely to see it. These days, you write something for the Boston Globe. It's digital, it's online, it travels. It can travel in incredibly interesting and unpredictable ways. And so I think that in addition to there being far more opportunity with its costs and benefits, there's also a different velocity to the stuff. And we can see scholars engaging in a way that unless you happen to get past the gatekeepers, to get into one of the few outlets that could travel back then, did not used to be possible, and now suddenly is not only possible, but often likely.
Mm-hmm. So Kate made a point about the kind of specialization of knowledge, and it kind of sparked something that I've been thinking about a long time in terms of specialization of knowledge and democracy, and the kind of fraught relationship between the two. So we have a number of debates that we, among specialists or a good swath of the public, these are things that are non-issues. They're not debatable. We could talk about evolution. We could talk about virology and vaccines. We could talk about the moon landing. Climate change. There's an array of things where people who have highly particular knowledge and people who are inclined to maybe listen or occasionally read people who have highly particular knowledge believe to be settled. But very significant parts of the public do not think these things. And there are spokespersons that will articulate, typically people who are not in academic backgrounds, spokespersons who will articulate views that are very much contrary to this. And so I wonder if this is something that is a conscientious idea, if this is part of the reason that you write, and this is, we're people who very often are, trained to argue and dissent in graduate school. We sit around tables and that's what we do. And if that's a part of the ethos for writing an op-ed or writing a magazine article, or if you are soliciting a piece from someone, in this idea of kind of saying we have to engage the public or other very often less rigorous individuals will engage that public.
I think we all need to do it and to write and engage the public, because if we don't, someone else will. And we have that knowledge that we can get the facts out there. We can shape the argument, I think. And maybe you all think it differently, but I think that's the precise reason that we need to be out there, is because we know things and can make a difference.
I think it's a little easier to shape the factual basis of the argument than it is to shape the conclusions. We're getting a lot of interesting social science research these days on persuasion. One of my favorite pieces of work done by Brendan Ian at Tufts looked at autism and sent out different packages of evidence to different parts of the sample. The more heavily weighted towards scientific evidence, the more definitive the debunking of an autism vaccine link, the more the recipients tended to believe in the link. We ought to be modest about our ability to change firmly committed positions. And we ought to be ambitious about our ability to reframe the factual basis of the discussion. That's aiming at the root rather than the branches. And I think that as scholars, we're often tempted to go right to the conclusion, to say, look, I've studied this a lot, and I'm telling you this is what we ought to be doing. And there's a power to that, but the power often derives from what comes first, right? First, you've got to build that factual framework and lay out the facts. Because for me, at least, when I'm editing a piece, what I want is a piece, my ideal reader reaction is, well, I don't quite buy that, but that was really interesting. I never thought about it that way before. I'm not going to get the reader who has the scales from the eyes moment more than one time in 1,000. But if I can get the honest disagreement, the understanding that people of goodwill disagree about this, that there are facts that have to be wrestled with, that the opinion that they maybe brought to the piece is at odds with some facts they hadn't previously encountered, and they're going to have to reconsider. That is a kind of a triumph of the persuasive art form. So instead of sort of viewing our role as to tell the public what to think, I mean, imagine these are your friends and family. If you're sitting around and you're holding forth and telling everybody what to think, you're probably not going to be the most popular guy at the party, right? That's not actually an effective way of persuading anyone of anything. And yet, often when we put on our op-ed hats, that's precisely the vein in which we write. And I think that approaching this stuff with humility, disclosing our own uncertainties, the problems with our own stances, is key to persuasion. And then also being modest about our aims and ambitions along one axis and ruthlessly ambitious along the other.
And I really like that. And the only other thing I'd add is not just being modest, but rigorous about what is actually known and what isn't. Mm-hmm. Because I think that there's a really problematic melding that happens there. So, are human beings changing the climate? They are, right? But we don't know everything about how they're doing it. And most of all, even if you accept that, which you must, right? If you look at the science, the conclusions that you draw from that are in no way obvious. Right? And sometimes you see this, to me, really troubling meld where people are asserting that human beings have changed the climate, which is true, but then asserting a policy implication of that with the same certainty, right? Or the other thing that really bugs me is when people assert that only one of our parties does this, or only one of our parties is anti-science. I won't say what, all right? But only one of our parties does. So how many people in Boulder, Colorado, who say that the Republican Party is anti-science because it denies climate change, which it does and which is awful, how many of them don't vaccinate their kids, right? A bunch. Who's anti-science here, bud? Both teams, not just one.
So I think there's I think there's another kind of element about this that I think we should also talk about in terms of when it comes to engaging the public. And so I think probably everyone in this room believes that historians have a vital function in a democracy. And then you kind of get the pulse of democracy in ways that perhaps you had not anticipated. I know I write a great deal about race, which in most common definitions means I'm a racist in kind of conversations. And among the more novel, I guess, interactions I had with someone was in writing about kind of gun violence and my own advocacy or belief in gun control. Was a person who was a white conservative who emailed me, and I decided I was going to engage this person, and we went back and forth and had this really interesting exchange, and then he just got frustrated and said, "You simply don't seem to understand that this government is fully capable of taking away people's liberty." And I was just kind of like, there's nowhere to go with this.
Did you say you're right? I don't.
Yeah, I don't understand. There's just I don't.
So at least you agreed on that.
Yeah, right. And so, but I think there's something else to be said about this, which is that there is a certain kind of complication that comes into this with how people manage antagonism or how people manage kind of virulent disagreement. I've gotten threats. I know that Kali Gross, who was supposed to chair this panel, talked about that as well. And I wonder if people would talk about how you anticipate or engage or respond to or just simply handle the fact that there are people who will go far beyond the bounds of kind of civil dialogue in responding to something that you write.
Nobody hates me yet.
Stick around.
Yeah, no, I know.
Sure
Thank
that?
you. No,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But as part of this fellowship, one of the things we do is we train and we mentor these faculty and community leaders to do these things. And in Texas, the right to carry guns on campus, that law has come out. We're not going to go down that path. But one of the faculty in our program wrote an op-ed about it, saying she was worried about grade inflation. A student comes to my office with a gun on their hip to discuss their exam grade.
Definitely an A.
Where do I put that, right?
Sure, yeah.
And
I didn't have to read the paper. It's
yeah,
an A.
right.
Yeah.
And she got some really very violent responses, and got police protection based on a few of these and things like that. And so we talked about, where do you go with that? And what risk do you put your family? Somebody sent her like a Google Street image of her house, and it got very personal. And she kept writing. But I think everyone has to make that personal decision of where is that line, threats of rape, all of these things. So I think that's something that we talk about in the training. Katie Orenstein is the founder of this Public Voices project, and she found that 10% of op-eds were written by women many years ago, and so she started this training, and it was primarily women in the beginning, and now the numbers are like 22% at the New York Times. So it really has made an impact. But one of the things she says, if we speak of things with consequence, there may be consequences. And the threat of not speaking is to be inconsequential, right? If you don't speak out, then, you know, you don't matter to a certain extent, right? Now she's trying to get all of us to write and to be inspired, but I think it's finding that personal line that you're willing to put out there. And some of these topics are very touchy. You know, race is obviously something that is a very, very sensitive issue for some people, for all people, I guess. And in Texas, the guns is really a hot topic. And, you know, I don't know. I'd probably give them the A. You know, but I don't want them to know that. You know, go ahead.
Well, look, you know, I as I mentioned before, you know, because I do this so much, inevitably you will have some really nasty people that write to you, you know, and I think it's easier to brush that off if you're male than you're female for obvious reasons, right? I mean, who's the major victim of sexual violence in this country? Not men, right? I think white and black changes the score as well, right? But I would emphasize that the vast majority of what I get is not that. That's there. We know it's there, you know, and perhaps if I were African American, perhaps if I were female, a greater fraction of it would be that, you know. But, you know, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post against term limits, which set it set the WAPO record for the month on the number of comments. I'd had, you know, like 2,500, but my inbox had almost that number because I was picked up on these right-wing websites, and then these kind of, if you don't mind the term, ditto heads will send you the same text over and over again. And the theme of the text was that I was just a shill for Obama, you know, and often they would begin with "it begins," right? And "it begins" again is this takeover, you know, this sort of kingship of Obama that somehow, you know, Zimmerman imagines. And incidentally, if you get a note that begins "Dear quote Professor unquote Zimmerman," you can stop. Right, because it's probably not going to teach you that much, right? But let me say two things. First of all, some of the comments were really interesting and made really good points. You know, they weren't all ditto heads, right? There were some very compelling responses to what I was saying. And then secondly, something that was nice is somebody reminded me, of course I had forgotten, that when George W. Bush was president, I wrote a similar column. We only have so many things to say, right? I had forgotten that I had written it. And after the American Spectator, which is a conservative magazine, wrote this thing slamming me, I just sent them the piece I had written saying that Bush should be able to stand for re-election. And if you like him, you vote for him, and if you don't, you don't. And the Spectator ran an apology.
Oh, that's nice.
You know, and they said, you know, we just dismiss this guy as a shill for Obama, but actually he's consistent in his view because, as he said in the Bush piece, he loathed Bush and thought he was a terrible president. But he thought that Bush, like any American, should have the right to stand for re-election. It should be up not to me, but to the citizenry. You know, so you learn good things too.
So this is a huge problem, and I wouldn't want to minimize it in any way. It's a burden that falls disproportionately. I get this stuff mostly when I engage with certain topics. For a woman, for a person of color who writes online, the mere fact of their being is enough to attract hate and threats of violence. That's our society, and what the internet has done to some extent is lowered the friction that it takes to transmit such threats, right? Somebody might never have sort of taken out pen and paper and written it out, might not have been able to locate the author's address. Now it's awfully easy to send these digitally, whether it's in a comment section, whether it's finding an email. If you're an academic, even if you're not putting your email on the byline, it's not terribly hard usually to track you down. For that reason, I always try to be upfront, particularly if an author is engaging with a highly controversial topic, to prepare them to brace themselves and to make sure they're making an informed decision about public engagement. I really don't want to minimize this. It is, the comments read differently based on your own personal history. The same threat of violence will strike two different writers very, very differently in terms of its gravity. And that's real, and it's a problem. I would encourage you to write for publications that are doing all they can to support you, that don't expose you to this unduly, but it's out there no matter where you write. There are offsetting benefits to public engagement, but the message here is not grow a thicker skin, toughen up. in some sense, if you become insensitized to the threat of, to a graphic threat of violence, that may not be entirely a healthy thing. It is useful to know that it's not unusual, and almost all of this is mere bluster. I think that's often something first-time authors don't know, or at least haven't internalized. They feel as if they are suddenly standing in the spotlight, and the truth is that these same trolls wrote to 35 other authors that day. They couldn't pick you out of a lineup. They have no idea who you are, even though they just Google Street Food you. They did it by 30 seconds of Googling and promptly forgot your address. I think it is reassuring to know the scale. I mean, perversely reassuring, right? Incredibly disturbing, and yet perversely reassuring to know the scale on which this stuff happens. That said, it doesn't happen to everyone. It doesn't happen across all topics. It doesn't happen as much across all outlets. It is often a kind of perverse metric of success. It seems, as best I can tell with writers I work with, to correlate with the impact your piece is having, with just the raw number of readers. A piece that's read by 1,000 readers may not get any trolls. If you publish with an outlet that's going to put it in front of 10,000 readers, you're going to pick up a few. If they're putting it in front of 100,000 more, and if your piece goes viral and hits 1 million, you're going to hear, almost no matter what you've written or what it's on, just because you've got a higher profile. But I don't want to exaggerate that, right? That's not the only experience you're going to have. You're also going to hear from 13-year-olds who are living where they are and have not encountered a voice like yours before, and write to you in all naivete, expecting that if you get an email in your inbox, you'll write back, and you probably will. I routinely hear from people after I write my own pieces who have some piece of evidence or information that all of my searches through archives had been unavailing, and yet they were sitting on it this whole time, and they just wanted me to know. So there can be really rich rewards to this kind of public engagement, but given that at least at present, it often carries this other cost, it's something I just encourage everybody to be aware of before they say go.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
No, I think there's this kind of two-sided, double-edged sword to it. One is, I can give you an anecdote about something that happened to my mother some years ago that will kind of explain this. I was with my mother in Atlanta, and we were, I forget where we were, but someone had come up and said that they liked something that I wrote. And my mother said, "Oh, that must feel really good," after the person left. I said, "Not really." And she said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, if I listened to that person, I'd also have to listen to the person that says I should never have picked up a pen." And I was like, there's a small number of people whose opinions matter to me. And I like to engage with the public, and I hope that people are interested in what I have to say. But I have to, for purposes of almost integrity, block out that kind of response. Because I think in other instances, and I've had this conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates as well, because he's a long-time friend of mine who's had an immense amount of success, and he said that he thought in some instances that compliments are as corrosive as insults in some ways for people who were trying to be conscientious, especially in terms of public engagement. On the other side of it...
So hold on, sorry, Caroline, can you explain to me why the compliment's corrosive?
Well, because we all, as contrary as it may seem, we all have egos.
We're all people.
Yeah, we're all people. And we all like affirmation, and we can sometimes err on the side of the things that will give us affirmation, whether or not that's the thing that we actually deeply feel, or whether or not that's the thing that actually needs to be said at a particular point in time. Sometimes you have to say the thing that is going to make people really upset with you, and that they may say 6 months down the line, or a year down the line, or as historians, 20 or 30 years down the line, well, this person actually had it right. At the time, we thought that they were crazy, but they actually were onto something. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is, when I wrote a book on Barack Obama at the point where everyone was writing books on Barack Obama, and I'd done an op-ed about him and his relationship with the previous generation of civil rights people. And the publisher wanted to know why another book. In that instance, I printed out, I think, 1,000 or 1,100 responses, email responses, and physically mailed them to the publisher which was kind of a stunt. It was admittedly a stunt, but it was a stunt that they got me a book deal. So,
And if you want to know why the rainforest is smaller,
well, yeah, there's that too. But I did multiple emails per page, so it was somewhat conscientious. On the other side of it, there have been people who have threatened violence, against me. If I'm amused, I may say, someone's emailed and threatened to kick my ass, and then I've replied, maybe you want to see me first. If you decide you want to change your mind after actually seeing me, because I don't look like the idea of a historian, And then if I'm not, I just don't, kind of on other things I take more seriously. And I've reached a point where I don't read responses at all. I may read maybe 1% of things. And if someone has something to say, I may hear about it throughout the circuits, but I don't engage there. I want to make sure we have time for audience engagement on that topic. I have one last question, which is I know Jonathan mentioned some of this, for people who are interested in contributing to any kind of array of media outlets about something that you're knowledgeable about, like how you would recommend this work, that they do this. There's two things I know I'd like to say up front, which is that people who are writers tend to think, how will I get this into a publication? People on the other side of it who are at publications are tending to look at waking up each morning saying, I have to find things to publish. And they tend not to think of it in that way, that there's actually a group of people who are trying to look. It's like a dating site, people who are looking for you and you're looking for them. It's just a matter of you all connecting with each other. And the other is that there's a kind of cycle to kind of media organizations. That something that was an op-ed in some place, that there's a radio producer who's saying we want to interview this person, and then a television person who's saying we want to have this person on to talk about this topic. And those three things are very much kind of cyclical. They're all related to each other. But I wondered if Yoni and Kate had something to add as well in terms of how to approach these, an editor, or how to approach a producer and to get your perspective out there.
I think he's got the smarter angle. I'm just going from training, but the idea is to keep your pitch short and to the point, and get your bio in there of why. One of the big parts of the training of this program was to convince people that they really are an expert, and to have that confidence, and then to be able to communicate that you're an expert. Why are you the person that should write this piece? And so that was a big part of it. Was we'd all practice. We had a big thing where we all had to pull out our shiny baubles, right? Of important things about ourselves. We all give little bios of ourselves. And one woman had actually left out the fact that her degree was from Harvard, because so many people are snobby about Harvard. And it's like, no, that's actually a positive that you went to Harvard.
I trained in Cambridge.
Yeah, right. There you go. See, he's not shy. And that's actually one thing that women tend to, right? The men announce to an open crowd when they haven't been asked that they went to Cambridge, right?
I didn't, by the way.
Right?
I don't like people who say it.
No, yeah. But women tend to hide their shiny baubles, right? We don't say, I worked on an NPR piece, or I was just nominated for an Emmy, or right, different. We don't say those things because it's bragging, and that's crass for women to brag, right? And I think people of color are in the same situation where it's socially not as accepted for us to brag on ourselves, right? And we want to be humble, I think, about who we are and what our experience is, and so that was a big part of our training. Now, you actually are on the other side of it, so I'm curious if you agree, or what's your take on this?
There's no one formula for success. You're talking to editors at a wide variety of publications who are looking for different things, who will have their own quirks and idiosyncrasies. So just because you try something once and it doesn't succeed doesn't mean that it won't avail you the next time. One of the disconcerting things about making this jump was suddenly getting full access to all the analytics, and you quickly discover what gets read and what doesn't, how far into a piece somebody gets. Often when I get pitches from academics, the pitch is, sometimes it's a fully written article, but if it's just a few paragraphs, it's written the way the introduction to a journal article would be written. here's the existing scholarship on this.
Scholars have long debated.
Right? But even if it's detailing it, right? It'll start sort of autobiographical. I've been researching this topic for 20 years, and it's rich and nuanced, and I would like to write for you something about the topic. Rarely do I actually get the argument in the initial pitch. That is, here's the thing that I want to say. Here's the piece of evidence I want to introduce. Here's the payoff. What I get is sort of a subject area of concern to this writer. And it's very hard to know what to do with that, to take the time to write back to them and say, that's a fascinating subject. Do you have something to say about it? Or just it's easier to sort of ask an assistant editor to send them a kind rejection. So I guess the most important thing is to remember that you're being judged as a writer as much as you are as a scholar. Write something. Your email should be something that the editor actually wants to read, not just the article itself. If you have a clear point, that's probably your first sentence, not the fifth. If and you can even sort of sit there and revise the thing a couple of times. Take the extra 10 to 20 minutes and make sure that it reads well. If there's obvious spelling errors in it, I mean, these sound like trivial tips, but I routinely get pitches with I think, how careful is this scholar if this is the pitch, if this is how they want to represent themselves to me. So write it well. I think there's lots of approaches. Keep it relatively short because they're sifting through a lot, and they'll let you know if they want more. If you've got something already written, there's no harm in sending that. It gives them a clearer idea. But if you don't want to invest that time up front, if you'd rather work with the editor on the guidelines after you know which publication and what their own needs are going to be, that makes sense too. But make it writerly. Make it engaging. Make it something that as an editor, imagine an editor going through an inbox with several dozen new pitches every morning, and trying to decide which ones are worth following up on, which are not. It may not be the most consequential. It may not even be on the basis of credentials. But if they read something that's really arresting and they want to read more, they're going to ask you for more.
Yeah, I mean, I still am an 800-word guy, and I should tell you that I write for newspapers because most people actually still read a print newspaper. That's where the 800-word thing comes from. I know it's changing in different venues. What I advise people to do is, first of all, this is going to sound really pedestrian, but it isn't. Don't send an attachment. Paste in your 800 words. Because again, you got to think of the woman or man on the other end, and they've got a gazillion things. It actually does add labor and hassle, right, to click on these attachments, and sometimes they screw up and and then. Just a brief salutation beginning, dear Ms. Mr. So-and-so, what this piece shows us is X, and then include your cell phone number. Editors hate it when you don't do that, because often, it's easier for them just to pick up their phone and call you, right, and if there's no number, they can't, but just something very brief that says, here is the takeaway. So, I have something in the Pittsburgh paper this morning about heroin in New Hampshire, because it now turns out that the candidates of both parties are all about treatment and prevention, and not about locking them up and throwing away the key, which I said in the piece was quite salutary, but we have to ask ourselves why, and the point I tried to make is because heroin addicts in New Hampshire are white, and the way that they are, not all of them, but the vast majority, and the way that we judge drugs in this country historically isn't actually about what's in the drug, it's about who uses it. So in two sentences, I could say, there's about the heroin epidemic, right? And the point I'm making, right? And I didn't say the point I'm making. I just said, what it should, it's that the way we judge a drug has to do not with the properties of the substance, but with who's using it. So morphine wasn't a big problem, in the 19th century when, Civil War vets or middle-class women were using it or giving it to their kids as teething syrup, which they did, right? But when it became associated with Chinese people in San Francisco, it became a big problem, right?
Make the bold claim first, and then give all the nuance and the subtleties and the examples. Yeah. But the bold claim comes first.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to make sure we have time to engage. This person in the back, and then the person in front of her with the hat.
I'm Tracy Wilson. I'm the editorial director at HouseOfWords.com and co-host of the Stuff We Missed in History Class podcast. So I'm basically the media. There's two things. One is on the subject of getting violent threats in response to your work. There are a lot of websites you can go to opt out of having your home address and other personal information to basically prevent your personal information from being leaked to people who may want to send violent threats to you. So I wanted to basically mention that. It's been really interesting as an outsider at this meeting because I do not have a history degree. I've been in a lot of panels that have talked about the importance of historians reaching out to the community, and in some cases, simultaneously admiring the work that we do as lay historians on stuff you missed in history class and disparaging it as not real history. So I was wondering if, in the panel's opinion, the field of history and its outreach efforts are being hampered by a degree of snobbery for the people who aren't real historians.
Who wants to touch that one?
Look, the whole system is a system of snobbery. I mean, you know, George Bernard Shaw said that every profession is a conspiracy against the lady. Okay? And at a certain level, I mean, like everything with Shaw, it was sort of like cute and both true and false, but metaphorically it works. Nobody has raised the issue, which I think is related to the very smart comment here, about the incentives in our own profession. In our own profession. Why am I missioning here? The reason I'm missioning is that we haven't created structures that incentivize this. So I'm pleading with you, right? This would be a great thing for our country, for you, for our profession, right? But until your department chair is going to credit this as actual history, right? It's going to be hard for you to make the argument to yourself when you have a million other things that are credited and are incentivized to carve out time to do it, right? Why is that, right? What does that say about us? And it's ironic too. I mean, I get a lot less of this than I did, by the way, many years ago. When I first started out, I had senior colleagues say, don't do this. It's going to mark you as a facile person, right? And if lay readers can understand you, how important is what you're saying? Right? Now this is doubly ironic, of course, because all of us have lay readers. They're called our students. Right? But these things are related too, right? I mean, what's credentialized? What's incentivized? You walk around this meeting, right, and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, John, how you doing? What are you working on?" Right? They're not talking about your teaching, right? And they're not talking about your op-eds, right? They're talking about your scholarship.
Well, I mean, I think there's also, I believe it was with this organization, where there was that ambivalent reaction to Jim McPherson and Battle Cry of Freedom, because there was a Civil War book that was on the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and there was even a question to people about whether or not this was valid or if this is what historians should be doing. And we've almost gotten away from the idea that people once thought of history as literature, like they thought of history in literature as kind of related fields. And so I think that happens, to answer your question, that happens not simply with lay historians. I think there are different tiers, to Jonathan's point, there are different tiers of that within the profession itself. And if we were to really, I guess, be controversial, we'd be talking about who was at what institution and, whose dissertation advisor was this person and so on. And I think that all of that tends to have a silencing effect on many people within the profession. But we could have a panel on that in and of itself.
My favorite thing about history as a discipline is that ordinary people spend their own time and money to read the work that academics produce. There are vanishingly few disciplines within the academy where that's true. There are lots of disciplines in which there are popularizing works which distill or which take, right? But people don't read biology papers for fun. They for the most part, they don't read economics papers for fun. Whereas the core scholarly works of history in this discipline are books. And those books, some of them will have very limited monograph runs and be immensely valuable works along other registers. I don't mean to suggest that the popularity is some sort of objective or all-inclusive measure of the merit of a work. But it is nevertheless the case that I can walk through the Atlanta airport and see books by historians I know on bookshelves which people are picking up to pass the flight. That's just incredible. And even better, I can see books by non-historians on historical topics, because this is so much fun to read and write that other people want to get into. that's great. And I think that rather than feeling threatened by it, it will be a crisis for the discipline of history at the moment when people don't want to read the work and when other people who haven't gone through the elaborate and Byzantine credentialing process don't want to do it without that either. That will be the crisis, not sort of a blurring of boundaries.
Actually, everything bad began when we started to use the verb imprecate. Then it was downhill after that. I won't let my students use it. I'm like, what does that even mean? Yeah, imprecate? Huh? Yeah, see, I hope I'm not stepping on anyone's toes. Yeah.
The gentleman in the black hat.
Hi. So I thought you guys spoke very well about navigating the potential political consequences of scholars talking publicly about controversial issues, race, gender, class, those kinds of things. But I wondered if you could maybe speak about navigating the potential professional consequences of doing so as well. So I'm thinking specifically of all these cases that have arisen recently. So from Saida Grandi to Stephen Saleta being effectively blacklisted by their places of employment for dealing with these issues in a public manner. So I just wondered if you guys had any thoughts on that sort of thing.
So one of the things I was, another faculty and I were the ones that selected the people who would be a part of this fellowship. And we were always very careful when assistant professors applied and would make a phone call to their chair or get a sense of their department and have an understanding of what they wanted. And we would talk very carefully with that faculty about what are your tenure qualifications and how does your chair feel about this? And because you have to know where you are, right? Once you get tenure, if you work in a place with tenure, usually you're in a better place, but I think there are risks, right? The safe thing to do is to write monographs for university presses, right? That is the safe thing to do, and no one can blame you if you want to keep doing that, because there are risks and consequences.
Now, from outside of the profession looking in, it's maybe not the best position to answer that. But look, there's two halves to it. One is, when you go up before a CNP committee, how are they going to look at your scholarship? The other is, how are you representing yourself in public? If this is an act of scholarship, if you want to see this as part of your scholarly calling, if you want to make the case for public engagement and public scholarship, then be very conscious about how you are representing yourself as a scholar. I think most of the flashpoint cases, they're always complicated, and so I don't want to get into the specifics of any individual case. But how do I phrase this? I think when people try to think of their public engagement as a work of scholarship and an act of engaged scholarship, they may provoke controversy, but they rarely suffer direct consequences because it's clear to everybody that they are engaging as a scholar. That's not, I don't want to be too sweeping, certainly that there have been cases to the contrary, but that is that the best thing you can do is to comport yourself as a person who is serious about this stuff, and then as a outgrowth of that, you can engage through whatever kind of media you wish to engage. But if you adopt the style and tone that is most native to some of these media, if you engage with your interlocutors on Twitter the way that your interlocutors on Twitter will engage with you, that is a far riskier proposition because it's more difficult to present that as a work of scholarship. And so just be conscious in the same way that you wouldn't write these things if there's something you wouldn't feel comfortable saying to a scholarly audience, standing up at AHA and saying, then I think you ought to at least pause and consider before, as an engaged public scholar, you say it in some other format or venue.
That's kind of true, but it's kind of also not, because when we think about how people engage within the academy in kind of blind review processes or in graduate seminars around the table, like we have this kind of false dichotomy between scholars and trolls. Like we think a lot of times.
I'm a scholar.
Have you ever seen trolls here at AHA?
Right. I mean, I've been in rooms where I've seen critique given that really was not that different from trolling, what we would call trolling. And on the other side of it, I think I just to give one name, I think like someone like Richard Dawkins, who has tremendous intellectual caliber, obviously, and the way that he engages on Twitter is probably trolling, a tendency to lapse into that. So I think that's the point. I also should say that Saida Grundy was a student of mine at Spelman College. I know her well. I think that I had this conversation at the Ford Foundation for the Ford Foundation Fellows. I guess this was 3 or 4 months ago now. And one of the things I said is that I think that this is really something that people should be mindful of post-tenure. The upsides probably are outweighed by the downsides for people who are looking at all the kind of extraneous, ambiguous kinds of criteria that come up and why people vote the way that they do, or why people put obstacles in your path, and what the relationships are like with your institution and all these other kinds of things. There's another person who I know who is, let's just say a senior person, not a historian, but a senior person, very respected person in their field, who was effectively pushed out as a full professor, effectively pushed out of their institution as a result of their political stances. Outside of their political stances were outgrowth of scholarly work. But I think this is something that is true, and it's a real possibility. It's just something that you maybe minimize it by doing this post-tenure.
Yeah, can I add a few things, because I hear what Jelani's saying. I think it's essentially true, but I'm wary of it because I don't want to discourage anybody here from participating in this realm. And here's what I'd say. I write to places where, to borrow Yoni's term, there's a gatekeeper. I don't think all of you should or have to, but the reason I do is I want there to be other eyes on the other end saying, this is a reasonable thing to say, or this is worth saying, this is something that's new, right? This is something that's thoughtful, right? Now, obviously, those are all subjective judgments, but it's better to have somebody other than you making them, right? Look, I'm outraged by what happened to Salida and to Grundy, and I think that the lawyers for Salida and of the University of Illinois in some ways agreed with what I think, right? Which is, this guy was essentially unhired because of his point of view. But I encourage you to go and read his tweets, okay? Because earlier we were talking about sort of the nasty and snarky aspect of the internet. There's a lot of that in Salida, all right? In his tweets, I'm just underscoring his tweets. Again, please be clear about what I'm saying. I do not think he should have invalidated him for the job at University of Illinois. And I think most reasonable people ended up agreeing with me, right? But that doesn't make his tweets scholarly. They were extremely snarky because Twitter is the land of snark. It's not. Look. Let me be clear about that, right? It's not that everything on Twitter is snark, but Twitter lends itself exquisitely to snark, right? And that's what you have to guard against.
Now, so I do tweet, and I love it as a tool, but I know it doesn't have to silly. I know, right? I'm Kate Landdeck, and I tweet, but I use it strictly as a professional tool. I use it as I want to be an informer, right? So I share articles. Right, I point people to different op-eds or articles in the Landdeck, or I tweeted out about this meeting so people, Twitter historians could find it and things like that. So I really use it strictly as a professional tool. Right, you should have a public voice and a public face, and Twitter's a great way to do it. Facebook, I know there's a lot of people that have Facebook as well. You should have a professional Facebook page, and your personal Facebook page should be different, right? If you're going to go that way. Another thing about Twitter is don't drink and tweet, right? Don't drink and tweet, because I think that's where you can say stupid things, and once it's out there, right? It is a much more dangerous world. There's levels of danger, right? You speak at the historical society, and that's one level of danger. You can make people mad or say stupid things because right? And then you get to the AHA and you give a panel and the 3 people who come may think you're brilliant or stupid. Or you come to the AHA and 25 people come and they video it, right? That's another level of danger. And then if you tweet, that can be very dangerous. And you can stay out of a lot of trouble not doing it. But I think it is such a useful tool. I get all my news through Twitter. I check it in the morning and I get my Landdeck, I get it all. And then I can share it with people of like mind. So it's a useful tool.
I have a question based on my liminal, I can't even say it, liminal experience as a op-ed writer. John, you and I actually had an op-eds on exactly the same thing.
I hate it when that happens.
Which was when Florida decided that they would teach the Declaration of Independence, but not the Constitution. And I'm a historian of the Revolution, and so it was mine was in the New York Times, and I basically said, look at the implications of this, because there's no slavery in the Declaration of Independence. It's really clear that's what's going on. Anyway, so I have had this very peculiar experience, which is that I had 3 op-eds in the New York Times, one of which is that one, and nothing anywhere else. And the way the 3 happened in the New York Times was the Times approached me for the first one. And it was, I've written a book on Salem witchcraft. I'm Mary Beth Norton from Cornell. I've written a book on Salem witchcraft, and the Times editorial, or the Times op-ed editor at that time, was thinking, we got to have something for Halloween. I mean, this is people who Salem witchcraft, they just think that Halloween stuff is nuts. But anyway, my book had been out for a year or 2, and so he just emailed me and he said, would you like to do an op-ed piece for Halloween on Salem witchcraft? And I thought, my immediate reaction was, this is stupid, we all reject it. But I thought, well, why the hell not? It's promotion for my book. So I did it. So he really liked the way I did it. He really did. And so at the end of that, when we did our editorial stuff, he said, if you ever want to write an op-ed about anything else, just let me know. So then, fast forward a year or 2, and a friend in Rumsfeld was going around saying, his speeches by Ronald Rumsfeld, going around saying that the occupation of Iraq, the opposition to the occupation of Iraq was just like the Loyalists after the American Revolution. Well, one of my friends, I didn't see that, but one of my friends saw that somewhere and knew I'd written a dissertation and a book on Loyalists and the Revolution, and he emailed me and he said, is this right? And I said, that is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And so I, of course, emailed the op-ed editor at the Times and said, would you be interested in an op-ed on Rumsfeld? I swear to God, 20 seconds later it said yes. And so I did that one, and then eventually I did the same thing on the Florida thing. That's my only experience doing op-eds, literally. And I thought when I did the Rumsfeld thing, I'd get lots of negative reaction. Quite the contrary. My email box filled the next morning after it appeared with, I would say, over 100 emails, some from friends, some from people I didn't know, all saying, fantastic, wonderful, wonderful, blah, blah. I got no negative reaction to it whatsoever. The one time I've had a negative reaction, and this is very funny, it wasn't an op-ed, but years ago, the Ladies' Home Journal chose a panel of historians to help them pick the 100 most important women of the 20th century in American history or something like that. So I was on it. I thought, well, this is kind of a fun gig. So they brought us in, and it was all, we all finally realized it was all for show. We actually had some suggestions, and people proposed people that were in it, but one of the women they picked was Jane Fonda. And when that came out, all of us got hate mail from Vietnam veterans like you would not believe. And then
you should have chosen Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, right. Anyway, so that I never got any negative stuff to the op-eds. Anyway, so here's my question. This is a long involved story. Not the way you write an op-ed. Which is, so that's the only experience I've ever had doing op-eds. I would be interested in doing other op-eds. I have no idea how to find the names. This is a very basic question. I have no idea how to find the names of the editors. Who would be the person that you contact? Say in the LA Times or the whatever, other kinds. And of course, the editor I dealt with at the Times is long gone because editors move. And he's gone. So what are your suggestions for even finding out the people to approach when you have an idea for an op-ed?
Well, all the guests have a general, a general address, op-ed at X, right? but it is often
Really?
useful.
There is an
They
op-ed
do,
edit?
absolutely. Yeah, I can
Okay.
tell you what they are, and generally that's what they are. You know, the Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times are all that. You know, op-ed at LA Times, right?
Okay.
But it is sometimes useful. And look, you know, if you just look in the contact section, often they'll have the different desks. Right, you go to the editorial desk and you can find somebody, and it is useful. It is useful to have a name. And by the way, you know, don't be shy about writing somebody, you know, a day and a half later. You don't want to do it the next hour. I have an editor friend who calls me, John, did you get my piece, Zimmerman? Because, you know, again, call me selfish, call me crazy. Like, if I write something, I don't want it sitting on my hard drive. You know, like I want it out there, and so I'd at least like to know if you had a chance to give it a look.
So basically op-ed at something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. By the way, Mary Beth also neglected to say that she's also the author of obviously terrific textbooks and of a great piece about writing them, which I highly recommend because the themes in that piece are quite similar. If
What
I
about
recall.
writing textbooks?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the way the profession regards it, and the way it's incentivized or not, I think very cognate to this discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the white shirt.
I'm Jay Malone. I'm with the History of Science Society. Thank you all for this great presentation. Historians like nuance, and so I think all of these questions are related to that. What is the place of nuance in op-eds or in larger pieces? And how do you measure success? I mean, academics getting the book published with the first line press is success, but if you're trying to change opinion, I have a member, Alice Drager, who published a book, Galileo's Middle Finger. And Alice has this uncanny ability to piss off everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Conservatives and liberals and everyone in between. And to me, that seems to be the definition of success. But I would love to hear your opinion.
Well, I'm sorry, I was actually calculating the number of questions we could get in.
That's a nuanced answer.
I was thinking as a chair, not thinking as a person up here. But I think that's like, on the issue of nuance, it's more a matter of, to kind of slightly disagree with Yoni, I think that the genre of op-ed is not the problem, it's the, like, haiku. If you're writing a haiku, you have like this 575, is it 575, right? I was an English major once upon a time. But you have like this very constrained format, but you're trying to convey all sorts of subtleties and nuances within that format. And I think that the genre of op-ed is not necessarily inimical to nuance, but it does require a certain touch. And it is, you know, difficult. A lot of times it's easier to start with the final thing that you're going to say and work backward. And sometimes you just simply don't get it. Like there is such a thing as trying to fit too much into one piece as well. But I don't think that there's any one kind of formula for getting nuance into something in that format. But I think that it's one of the things that makes it tricky, but I also think that's one of the reasons why that's a particular art form. I think of column writing is really an art form in itself.
And it depends, I mean, I know this is like the dweeby, ridiculous academic thing to say, but it does depend on what you mean by nuance, you know? There's only so much complexity, right, that you can get into the op-ed format. But for me, in the op-ed genre, what nuance is trying to make a point that you haven't seen before, right, which is hard. I mean, sometimes you'll come up with something, generally I do it like when I'm running or in the shower, I'll come up with, God, this would be a great idea, and then you go on and you find that somebody scooped you. It is pretty hard to be original, but I think more than that, what it is for me is trying to take a position that isn't exactly red or blue, that doesn't correspond to the incredibly inimical and anti-intellectual polarization that is all around us. You know, I mean, I am what George Bush Sr. would have called a card-carrying liberal. I've never voted for a Republican in my life, right? But my team doesn't need me to say go team. They've got other people to do that, right? I don't feel like that's my job, you know? And what I try to do is write pieces where I try to find something that's problematic or laudatory about both teams. That's my version of nuance.
In the back of the gray, and then here. Yeah.
The biggest troublemaker in the room. Hi, I'm Kathy Butler from the University of Pennsylvania. If you know it already, my name is out there everywhere for all kinds of bad stuff. And, I just, I'm listening to this panel. I'm like, I'm the person probably in this room who has had the most experience with trolling, being called the B, being called the N-word, everything you could possibly imagine. And I started back on Twitter actually in 2008, but I switched to my real name because I was blogging in 2010. The biggest thing that happened to me was I made a comment when the Benghazi thing happened in the morning. I said, God, they should arrest this guy. And I was saying that out of a religion professor who was tired of seeing people burn Qurans and everything else. And I knew what kind of thing would happen. But at the time, I didn't know what would happen to me because by 11 o'clock that morning, Twitchy picked it up and he ran with it, and I had views for 2 weeks straight. My institution didn't know what to do with it. I've had incidents since then. So all I want to say is this, and I want to pose a question to the panel. If you get into this, you have to know what you're getting into. There are immense awards doing it. But what happens to me versus what happens to a white guy versus what happens to a white woman is completely different. The biggest epithet that I always get called is I'm a black Ivy League professor. Because I'm in this body, I'm going to get everything. When Zimmerman happened, you know this, Jelani, we all got attacked because we had black faces. So some of this, and I appreciate what you're saying, you don't want to be on Twitter, you want to do all this stuff. Some of us do this work because we have to, because we are in these bodies. We can't get out of them. And I can't be a white guy. Every day I say to people, I would love to be a white guy in a street jacket. I could just say what I want to say, and nobody's going to troll me. But because I look like me, I'm going to get trolled. Okay? So it doesn't matter. So that's number one. Number two is you got to figure out what your institution is going to do. Because institutions, from the top on down, don't know what to do with stuff. And they're not ready. I appreciate you saying you don't tweet, but if you don't tweet, nobody's going to see you. They just not. So the woman who asked the question about how do I get more op-eds, the biggest op-ed I probably ever had written was right after the Charleston shooting. I do religion. I wrote about this in the middle of the night. It went up the next morning. It got read all around the world. And how did that op-ed come about? Because somebody saw me tweeting in pain about 9 black people getting shot. Okay? So when you do this, you have to decide why you're doing it and what you're doing with it and how do you want to craft yourself. And I'm in the middle of sort of recasting myself all over again, but I'm not going to stop writing op-eds because that's where my history work comes from. And in the place where we're in right now with all of this, we all have to be aware of it, but you have to count the costs. You can't not count it. So my question to the panel is something a little bit different than everybody else. What do you say to the person who's been out there for a while doing this? How do you move from something else? Because now I'm like this person who's known as the Black Ivy League professor, and everybody thinks I'm radical. There are organizations right now that sit in your classrooms that have students listening to you for every bad thing you'll say. And this is actually the real panel that should be happening, because that part too, because it doesn't matter if you're writing op-ed or not. Anything you say now can be bad. And so I'd like to ask all of you, what is the risk, especially for those of you who publish, what is the risk for you to take something from somebody like me? Because I'm a name, but my name has different kinds of connotations, and I'm very aware of that right now. But nobody stopped asking me to not write op-eds. I just had one with The Guardian. So, what do you do? And I'm sort of asking that from the other side, and I didn't mean to take up all this time. I just felt like people in the room needed to see what this is really like from somebody that's happened to.
I think that there's a certain kind of social life that your kind of output can take on in its own right. And I'm of course familiar with the situation that happened with you. But I think there's also a kind of point at which you have to ask yourself why you do what you do. I don't feel like, for me, I went to Charleston and I wrote about Charleston, and it was exactly, here's what has happened more than once. I have found myself in circumstances where I felt as if my syllabus had jumped off the page. When I was in Ferguson, I was writing about things that I have taught about. When I was in Charleston, I was writing about things that I have taught about. And circumstances that have arisen out of dynamics that we're very familiar with historically. For me personally, I write these things because I think that this is the lesser amount of abuse. For the people who actually have lived through these kinds of struggles, the people who I think are heroic, who warrant room in your syllabus, or who students have to read about in their textbooks, I think that for me to deal with a little bit of abuse or a little bit of difficulty is a small thing. Other people may have a different calculation, but by that same token, I also have points where I step back, and there are things that I have not written about. There's some points we just say, just for my own well-being, I'm going to let someone else deal with this question, and it's a matter of, kind of self-protection. And maintaining your own kind of emotional well-being. That is absolutely one side of it. But I also think that the other point of it is that we can easily exist in cocoons in this society. And for better or worse, we now have a better idea of exactly what world we live in. I don't want to say this very quickly because I know we're running out of time. We would not have thought, people who are involved in this kind of discussion, public discussion, were not surprised that a presidential candidate could call an entire ethnicity rapists and then receive applause for it. Other people were kind of like, how could this happen? It seems like so completely outside of, but for better or worse, we are people who actually know what the kind of roiling, contentious, disturbed kind of thing that's happening in this culture because we've gone through it firsthand. But to answer your question most succinctly, I think people have to just weigh in. They strategically choose their battles. Sometimes you do something, sometimes you don't.
And speaking of strategic, I've got to run for a plane. I'm really sorry. I know that we're on it.
We have time to squeeze in maybe one question, unless someone else wanted to respond to this. You have a question as well?
Sure, yeah, thank you so much for this panel. I had a very specific and practical question. I've been writing some op-eds for the last few years, and my question is, what do you do when so this is something that happened to me last semester, someone has solicited me to write a piece, I write the piece, and it's clearly not what the editor wants me to say. So I think in this case, I kind of kept rewriting it, thinking for all of the reasons that you laid out, I need to engage the scholarship, I need to engage the public, that this is a kind of establishment, very important magazine, and I could put it in one that's more specific to my field of study, which is Chinese history, but I really wanted to reach this audience and I really want this to come out. So I rewrote these things 15 times, and there were things that I got pushed back on, saying, rewriting of what I had said, and I would write back and say, I don't have evidence to say this and highlight, I don't have evidence to say this, I don't have evidence to say this. And so at the end of the day, 2 months later, 15 drafts later, it was run it like this or not at all. And so for me, that was a really discouraging feeling of not knowing how to wanting to reach that public audience and wanting to be accurate and say what I had evidence for and what I didn't have evidence for. But at the end of the day, it was someone else wanting to make me say something that I didn't have evidence for, and that was deeply frustrating. So I'd really love to know how one negotiates that kind of situation where you were not prepared to say what the editor wanted you to say.
So I'll give you, it's tough to respond to the specifics of a situation that I'm not myself familiar with, but as general guidelines, I'll give you 2 pieces of advice. One is get on the phone, right? Often, and you may have done this, right? But for others facing a similar circumstance, sometimes the editorial, your comments you're getting back can feel like attacks on specific points, and what's ultimately motivating them is some sort of a structural concern or some sort of misunderstanding about the nature of your evidence or your argument, and just talking that through. You probably have this experience with students where you give them written comments and they come to your office hours and you're like, well, no, you're focused on the wrong thing here. Don't think about the order of the clauses. What we're really talking about is that the argument hasn't done what I wanted it to do, hasn't sort of reached the payoff it hasn't. And sometimes that conversation is generative, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes the editor may have been exactly what you're describing, which is somebody who had essentially assigned a piece that they wanted to come out a certain way, and facts were intruding. Kill it. Don't. You are under no obligation to the publication. They're going to be ruthless with you, and you should be equally ruthless with them. Write back to them and say, look, I'm really sorry that this hasn't gone in the direction that you wanted. I'd like your permission to take the piece elsewhere at this point. If you've signed a contract, if you haven't signed a contract, you could just tell them, or you can be a little bit more polite about that as strategically it seems wise to you. And take it somewhere else. If it's a piece that you believe in, there is another outlet that will get it. One of the beauties of the current digital environment is where you place a piece weights the odds of it reaching a large audience. But it's still a roll of the dice. And it's a roll of the dice both ways, right? You can publish with the most prestigious outlet in America and get a very small audience out of that. Or you can publish it, even if it's just putting it up on your own personal blog and reach hundreds of thousands or millions. It happens. It's not, the odds of that happening at one outlet versus the other can be quite different, but you're not bound anymore to sort of humble yourself before the demands of the gatekeeper who exercises that kind of power. If you're dealing with an editor like that what you're describing to me is sort of a dysfunctional relationship between an editor and a writer. If you're in a dysfunctional relationship, get out.
Yeah, we have to wrap up. I would concur with Yoni, kill, because I've been in that position, and I was to take one further step. I was in a position to publish a piece that would have been personally very lucrative. It was a publication that was paying at a very attractive rate, and we went back and forth on something which was about 4,500 words long. And then I just killed it because I said at the end of the day, I'm going to have to explain this to people. And I don't want my name attached to it. And I never wrote anything else for that publication, but I was pretty fine with it. And I actually ran it someplace else for free, which tells you how good a businessman I am. But thank you all so much for coming out. But some people can continue this conversation after.